Dad, you are not part of this family anymore. Those were the last words, my son. Daniel said to me before my family disappeared from my life for 10 long years. I was 71 years old and I had spent my entire life building something my children never knew existed. They thought I was an ordinary retired man living quietly in an old house. They had no idea that behind that simple life was a fortune worth $2 billion and an inheritance that could change their lives forever. For 10 years, nobody called me on my birthday. Nobody asked if I was healthy. Nobody cared whether I was lonely. My daughter Emily had stopped visiting after her marriage, and Daniel had moved to another state and slowly stopped answering my calls. I eventually stopped calling them too. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. And if your family has ever made you feel forgotten, hit like and subscribe. What they did not know was that I had deliberately kept my fortune secret because I wanted my children to build their own lives without depending on my money. I had built companies, invested wisely and quietly created an empire that eventually became worth more than $2 billion. Then one morning, my lawyer James arrived at my house carrying a thick black folder. He sat across from me and said, "William, we need to talk about your will." I asked him what had happened. He looked at me for a moment before saying, "Your family is about to discover everything you have been hiding." I felt my heart sink. After 10 years of ignoring me, they were finally going to learn the truth. But James was not finished. He opened the folder and said, "There is a serious problem with the inheritance." James opened the folder and showed me the inheritance plan. I expected to see my children listed as equal beneficiaries, but instead, I saw several pages marked with red notes. I asked him what was wrong. He told me that during the last year, Daniel and Emily had both made financial requests through people connected to my estate without ever contacting me directly. They had no idea that every request had been recorded. I felt disappointed more than angry. They had ignored me for 10 years yet. Somehow they had started preparing for the money they believed I would leave behind. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. James then explained that my original will had been written years earlier and that I had recently changed it after realizing how distant my family had become. I asked him if my children would still inherit anything. He looked at me and said, "That depends on what you decide." Today, I stared at the folder and thought about the birthdays they had missed and the calls they never made. I had spent my entire life believing that family meant being there for each other. Now I was beginning to wonder if my children only wanted the father they imagined would leave them money. Then James placed another document on the table. It was a letter from Daniel. I opened it expecting an apology. Instead, the first sentence made my hands tremble. "Dad, we know you are worth billions." I looked at James in disbelief. My family had somehow discovered my fortune before I was ready to tell them. And the next line of Daniel's letter was even more shocking. The next line of Daniel's letter said, "We believe you have a responsibility to make things right for the family." I read it twice because I could not believe what I was seeing. After 10 years of silence, my son had finally written to me, but he was not asking how I was. He was talking about my money. He claimed that he and Emily had been struggling financially and that I had been unfair by keeping my wealth hidden from them. I placed the letter on the table and asked James how they had discovered my fortune. He told me someone had leaked information about one of my private companies. I immediately knew this was not a coincidence. My children had never shown interest in my business before. Now suddenly they knew about billions. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. James then showed me another document. It was an email from Emily. She had written that our family deserved to know what I owned and that I should stop pretending to be a poor retired man. Those words hurt more than I expected. I had never pretended to be poor. I simply lived quietly. I asked James if they had contacted anyone else. He nodded and said they had already spoken to several people connected to my estate. Then he told me something that made me realize this was bigger than a simple family argument. Daniel and Emily had been discussing the possibility of challenging my will if they were not satisfied with their inheritance. I sat back in my chair and felt a strange calm come over me. For 10 years they had forgotten me. Now they were suddenly interested in my life because they believed I had billions waiting for them. I told James that I wanted to meet my children. He asked if I was sure. I said yes. But I also told him that I would not reveal everything during that meeting. I wanted to hear what they truly wanted from me. The following afternoon, Daniel and Emily arrived at my house together. They walked through the front door and looked around the simple home where I had lived for years. Then Daniel smiled and said, "Dad, we need to talk about your fortune." The document James placed in front of me was not another inheritance agreement. It was a record of a private meeting between Daniel and Emily and a financial advisor they had contacted without my knowledge. I read the first page slowly and felt my disappointment turn into anger. They had already discussed how my fortune could be divided between them before they even knew what I wanted. They had also discussed moving some of my assets into accounts they could control after my death. Daniel immediately tried to explain that they had only been protecting the family. I looked at him and asked, "Protecting the family or protecting yourselves?" He had no answer. Emily lowered her eyes. "Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from." James then revealed that there was something even more serious. Someone had given Daniel and Emily private information about my companies and investments. That information could only have come from a person who had access to my confidential records. I asked James to investigate immediately. He told me he already had a name. It was an employee who had worked with me for almost 15 years. I could not believe it because I had trusted that man completely. Daniel suddenly became nervous and asked if the employee had been arrested. I looked at him carefully and asked why he seemed so concerned. He said he was only curious. But James noticed something else. Daniel had received several payments from an account connected to that employee. I stared at my son in disbelief. For 10 years he had ignored me. Now he knew about my fortune, and money was suddenly moving between him and someone inside my company. I asked Daniel directly if he had been trying to access my financial information. He denied everything. Then James placed one final page on the table. It showed a message Daniel had sent only 3 days earlier. The message contained 5 words that made my blood run cold. "Find out when he dies." I could not move for several seconds after reading those 5 words. "Find out when he dies." I looked at Daniel and asked him what those words meant. His face turned pale and he immediately said the message had been taken out of context. I asked him what context could possibly make those words acceptable. He had no answer. Emily looked at her brother with disbelief and asked if he had really sent the message. Daniel refused to speak. James explained that the message had been sent to the same employee who had been leaking my private financial information. I realized that Daniel had not simply been curious about my fortune. He had been planning around my death. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. I asked Daniel to leave my house. Emily started crying and said she had not known about any of this. I told her that she needed to decide whether she was going to stand beside her brother or face the truth. Daniel became angry and accused James of manipulating me. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. "You have no idea how much money you are going to lose if you keep listening to him." I stared at him and realized he had already counted my fortune as his own. James quietly told Daniel that he was no longer welcome inside any of my companies or financial offices. Daniel threatened to challenge the will in court. I told him he was free to do whatever he believed was right. After he left, Emily remained seated in silence. She finally admitted that she had known Daniel was looking into my fortune, but she never believed he would go this far. I asked her why she had not warned me. She said she was afraid of losing her brother. I told her that keeping silent had allowed him to go even further. Then James received a call from his office. His expression changed immediately. He told me that investigators had found something hidden inside one of my old company accounts. It was a transfer worth several $1,000,000, and the money had been sent to an account belonging to someone I had trusted for decades. The account belonged to my longtime business partner, Richard. I had trusted him for more than 20 years and had shared some of my biggest business decisions with him. I could not understand why he would secretly receive millions from an account connected to Daniel. James told me the transfer had been divided into several smaller payments so nobody would notice. But the investigators had traced every transaction. I asked Richard to come to my office the next morning. When he arrived, I placed the records in front of him and asked one question. "Why did you take my money?" Richard looked at the documents and remained silent. Then he admitted that Daniel had approached him months earlier. Daniel wanted information about my private companies and my investments. Richard said he had initially refused, but Daniel offered him a large payment. I felt betrayed by both of them. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. Richard then admitted something even more disturbing. Daniel had been planning to challenge my will and wanted Richard to provide evidence that I was no longer mentally capable of managing my fortune. I asked Richard if he believed I was incapable. He lowered his head and said he knew. I was perfectly capable, but he had allowed greed to cloud his judgment. James immediately told him that the investigation was already underway and that he would need to cooperate fully. Richard agreed. Before leaving, he gave James a copy of a recording he had secretly kept from one of his meetings with Daniel. I listened to the recording in complete silence. Daniel was talking about my fortune as if it already belonged to him. He said that once I was gone, he and Emily would control everything. But then he mentioned something that shocked me. He said there was another person helping them, someone who had known about my fortune long before Daniel did. I asked Richard who that person was. He looked at me and said, "William, I think you already know him." Then he gave me the name. It was the one person I never expected to be involved. The name Richard gave me was Michael Carter, my younger brother. I had not spoken to Michael in almost 6 years after we had a serious disagreement over our father's property. I never imagined he could be involved in a plan against me. James explained that Michael had been communicating with Daniel for months and had been telling him that I was becoming too old to manage my wealth. He had also given Daniel information about some of my private investments. I felt a deep sense of betrayal because Michael knew exactly how hard I had worked to build everything. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. James then showed me several messages between Michael and Daniel. They had discussed my health, my assets, and even the possibility of convincing a doctor to declare me incapable of managing my own affairs. I looked at the messages again and again. Daniel had not simply been waiting for my inheritance. He had been trying to find a way to take control while I was still alive. I asked James what we could do. He told me that the evidence was enough to protect my assets and expose the people involved. But I did not want revenge. I wanted the truth. I called Michael and asked him to meet me at my house. He arrived that evening and looked nervous. I placed the messages on the table and asked him why he had helped my son. Michael admitted that he had been angry with me for years and believed I had kept the family fortune away from him. Daniel had promised him a large amount of money after my death. I asked Michael if he really believed I would leave my children nothing. He said he did not know. Then he looked at me and said something that changed everything. "William, Daniel is not the only one who wants your fortune." I asked him what he meant. Michael pulled a folded document from his jacket and placed it on the table. He said someone much more powerful had been helping Daniel from the beginning. And that person had a reason for wanting control of my $2 billion empire. The person helping Daniel was not a family member at all. Michael told me it was the chairman of a major investment group that had tried to buy one of my companies several times. I had always refused because I knew he wanted control over my entire business empire. Michael said the chairman had promised Daniel enough money to change his life if Daniel could help him gain access to my private financial information. I asked how they planned to take control of everything. Michael explained that they wanted to make me appear incapable of managing my own affairs and then use legal pressure to gain control of my assets. I looked at James and asked if they could really do that. He shook his head and said they had underestimated how much evidence we already had. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. James immediately contacted the investigators and provided them with the documents Michael had given us. Within days, the situation changed completely. Daniel and Richard were questioned about the financial transfers, and Michael agreed to cooperate. But there was still one person we needed to confront. The chairman had no idea that we knew about his plan. I decided to meet him personally. James warned me that it could be dangerous for my business, but I told him that I wanted to hear his explanation directly. We arranged a private meeting at one of my offices. When he entered the room, he smiled confidently and said, "William, I think it is time you finally considered retirement." Looked at him and smiled. He had no idea that I already knew everything. I asked him why he had been speaking to my son. He denied knowing Daniel. Then I placed the recording from Richard on the table. His expression changed immediately. I told him that the investigators had copies of every transaction and every message. For the first time, he realized his plan had failed. But before he left, he leaned toward me and said something that made me realize this fight was far from over. "You may control the company today, William, but you cannot control what your own family will do tomorrow." I watched the chairman walk out of my office, And for the first time, I understood how carefully the entire plan had been built. He had not simply wanted my money. He wanted control of everything I had created. But he had made one mistake. He underestimated how prepared I was. James told me that the evidence we had collected could stop the chairman from making any move against my companies. The investigators were also preparing legal action against everyone involved. Daniel, however, was still trying to defend himself. He called me that night and begged me to meet him one more time. I agreed because I wanted to hear the truth from my own son. When Daniel arrived, he looked completely different from the confident man who had walked into my house days earlier. He sat across from me and admitted that he had been afraid of losing his comfortable life. He said he had watched other wealthy families inherit fortunes and believed I was hiding money from him. Because I did not trust him, I told him that I had never expected him to earn my fortune. I had only wanted him to earn his own life. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. Daniel lowered his head and said he was sorry. I asked him if he was sorry for betraying me or sorry because his plan had failed. He could not answer. Then he gave me a document. It was his resignation from every position he held in my companies. He said he no longer wanted control over my business and would accept whatever consequences came from his actions. I looked at the document for a long time. Part of me wanted to forgive him because he was still my son. But another part of me knew forgiveness did not mean trusting him again. I told him that I would not decide his future that night. He would have to face the consequences first. After he left, James entered the room carrying another folder. He said the investigators had uncovered one final detail about my inheritance plan. Someone had changed a document without my permission. I opened the folder and froze when I saw the signature. It was mine. But I had never signed that document. The signature looked exactly like mine, but I knew I had never signed the document. James explained that someone had copied my signature from an old contract and used it to create a fake inheritance agreement. The document claimed that I had already agreed to transfer control of several companies to Daniel and Emily. Felt a cold anger rise inside me. This was no longer just a family dispute. Someone had tried to steal my empire while I was still alive. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. James immediately sent the document to the investigators and they confirmed that it was fraudulent. The digital records showed that the file had been created from an office computer connected to the investment group. The evidence finally connected the entire scheme. Daniel had provided information. Richard had leaked financial records. Michael had helped them understand my family situation. And the investment chairman had financed the plan. I asked James what would happen next. He told me that the authorities were preparing charges and that my assets were fully protected. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. But then James reminded me that the inheritance itself still needed to be decided. I looked at the original will and thought about my family. I had spent years believing that my children would eventually understand the value of what I built. Now, I knew that money could destroy relationships when people believed they deserved it. I decided to make one final change. I would not simply leave my fortune to my children. I would create a foundation that would protect most of my wealth and use it to help families and communities for generations. My children would still receive something, but they would not receive control of my empire. James asked me if I was sure. I told him I was. Then he showed me the final page of the new inheritance plan. At the bottom was one condition that would determine exactly what Daniel and Emily would receive. It was a condition neither of them had expected. The condition in my new inheritance plan was simple, but powerful. Daniel and Emily would receive a share of my fortune only if they proved that they could live without depending on it. They would receive no control over my companies and no access to the main family assets until they completed a 5-year period of responsible financial independence. James told me the condition was legally strong and designed to protect the fortune from anyone trying to manipulate my children. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. When Daniel and Emily learned about the new will, they were furious at first. Daniel accused me of punishing him for his mistakes. I told him I was not punishing him. I was giving him a chance to prove that he wanted a relationship with his father rather than a relationship with my money. Emily reacted differently. She came to my house alone and apologized. She said she finally understood why I had kept my fortune private for so many years. I told her that forgiveness was possible, but trust would have to be rebuilt slowly. Meanwhile, the investigation against the chairman and everyone involved continued. Richard agreed to cooperate fully and admitted that he had received payments. Michael also gave investigators additional evidence about the plan. The chairman was eventually removed from his position and faced serious legal consequences. Daniel avoided the worst consequences because he cooperated with the investigation and admitted what he had done. But the relationship between us remained damaged. I knew money could not repair 10 years of distance in one conversation. So I decided to do something I had never done before. I invited Daniel and Emily to spend a full week with me without discussing my fortune or inheritance. I wanted to know if we could still be a family without money standing between us. On the first evening, nobody knew what to say. Then Emily looked at an old family photograph and started crying. She whispered, "Dad, I forgot how much we lost." I looked at both of my children and realized that maybe the greatest part of my inheritance was not money at all. It was the chance to rebuild the family we had almost lost. The condition in my new inheritance plan was simple but powerful. Daniel and Emily would receive a share of my fortune only if they proved that they could live without depending on it. They would receive no control over my companies and no access to the main family assets until they completed a 5-year period of responsible financial independence. James told me the condition was legally strong and designed to protect the fortune from anyone trying to manipulate my children. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. When Daniel and Emily learned about the new will, they were furious at first. Daniel accused me of punishing him for his mistakes. I told him I was not punishing him. I was giving him a chance to prove that he wanted a relationship with his father rather than a relationship with my money. Emily reacted differently. She came to my house alone and apologized. She said she finally understood why I had kept my fortune private for so many years. I told her that forgiveness was possible, but trust would have to be rebuilt slowly. Meanwhile, the investigation against the chairman and everyone involved continued. Richard agreed to cooperate fully and admitted that he had received payments. Michael also gave investigators additional evidence about the plan. The chairman was eventually removed from his position and faced serious legal consequences. Daniel avoided the worst consequences because he cooperated with the investigation and admitted what he had done. But the relationship between us remained damaged. I knew money could not repair 10 years of distance in one conversation. So I decided to do something I had never done before. I invited Daniel and Emily to spend a full week with me without discussing my fortune or inheritance. I wanted to know if we could still be a family without money standing between us. On the first evening, nobody knew what to say. Then Emily looked at an old family photograph and started crying. She whispered, "Dad, I forgot how much we lost." I looked at both of my children and realized that maybe the greatest part of my inheritance was not money at all. It was the chance to rebuild the family we had almost lost. For the first time in 10 years, my children sat at my dinner table without talking about my money. We talked about old memories instead. Emily remembered the small house where she grew up, and Daniel laughed about the time he broke my favorite watch as a child. I had forgotten how much I missed those simple moments. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. The next morning, Daniel apologized for the first time without asking for anything. He admitted that he had allowed greed and fear to control him. He said he had spent years believing that I had forgotten about him when the truth was that he had been the one who stopped caring. I told him that I could forgive him, but rebuilding trust would take time. Emily also admitted that she had allowed her brother and other people to convince her that my fortune was more important than our relationship. I told them that money could buy comfort, but it could never buy back 10 years of lost family memories. Over the next few months, things slowly changed. Daniel began calling me every week just to ask how I was doing. Emily started visiting me regularly, and sometimes we would spend hours talking about things that had nothing to do with business. Meanwhile, my foundation began preparing its first major project. I wanted to help elderly parents who had been abandoned by their families and people who had spent their lives building businesses but had nobody left to support them. James told me the foundation could eventually become one of the largest charitable organizations in the country. I told him that was exactly what I wanted. My fortune had been built through decades of work, but I wanted its final purpose to be something bigger than my family. Then one afternoon, James arrived with an update that surprised me. The investigation had uncovered the full financial scheme, and the chairman had agreed to reveal everything in exchange for a reduced sentence. His confession proved that Daniel had not been the person who started the plan. He had been manipulated by people who saw my family as an easy target. But there was still one final piece of information in his confession. It explained why my family had been targeted in the first place. And when James showed me the document, I finally understood the real reason they wanted my $2 billion fortune. The real reason they wanted my fortune was not simply the $2 billion. They had discovered that one of my oldest companies owned valuable technology rights that were expected to become worth several billion more in the future. The investment group wanted control of those rights before the public knew their true value. That was why they had spent so much time studying my family and looking for a way to gain control of my estate. I felt relieved that the truth had finally come out, but I also felt sad that my children had been used so easily. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. Daniel asked me if I would ever trust him again. I told him that trust could return, but only through actions. He accepted that answer without arguing. That was the moment I knew he was finally changing. A year passed and my relationship with both children became stronger than it had been in decades. Daniel never asked about my fortune again. Emily started helping with my foundation and spent time visiting elderly people who had been abandoned by their families. One evening, she told me that she finally understood what I had been trying to teach them all along. I had not built my fortune so my children could inherit a number. I had built it so I could create something meaningful with the time I had left. James then brought me the final version of my estate plan. Most of my fortune would go into the foundation while Daniel and Emily would receive enough to live comfortably without controlling my companies. I signed the documents and felt a huge weight disappear from my shoulders. Then I called my children into the room and told them the inheritance was no longer the most important thing. Their relationship with me was. Daniel hugged me and started crying. Emily held my hand and said, "Dad, we should have come back 10 years ago." Smiled and told them that we could not change the past, but we could choose what happened next. That night I looked at the old family photographs on my wall and realized something. For 10 years I had believed my family had abandoned me. But now I understood that sometimes people lose their way and only return when they finally understand what truly matters. The next morning, I prepared to announce my final decision about the $2 billion fortune. And this time I knew exactly where every dollar would go.